It's no secret that the past year or two have been a challenging time for many trucking fleets. We've seen some big names go out of business. Other fleet operations, however, seem to be doing pretty well. We're going to take a mid-year look at the economy and industry and talk about some ways fleets can better deal with these kinds of booms and busts. Welcome to the HDT Talks Trucking podcast. I'm editor and associate publisher Deborah Lockridge. Today we're going to get a sort of mid-year State of the Union perspective from Brian Holland, president and CEO of Fleet Advantage, a company that helps trucking fleets make better decisions using data analytics and flexible financing and industry expertise. Obviously, keeping a finger on the economy and the industry pulse is an important part of that. So, Brian, welcome to HDT Talks Trucking.
Delighted to be here. Thank you.
So the past few years have been a roller coaster ever since the COVID-19 pandemic hit. Feels like we've been on the downside of that for a while now, that we've been kind of bouncing along the bottom. When it comes to freight rates and the financial health of trucking fleets, what are you seeing? What are the kind of the economic and industry indicators telling you about where we are in the cycle?
Well, Deborah, I would tell you that the state of the economy has certainly been a challenge for our industry in 24, but it's also been a time of opportunity. Despite the pressure on rates and ongoing issues like truck parking, fuel prices, and driver shortages, we are seeing signs of improvement. Industry analysts are suggesting that freight demand will recover, driven by consumer spending and retail sales. Unfortunately, freight rates were stagnant in the first quarter. The GDP growth was smaller than any of the previous 4 quarters. Freight shipments and spending, both declined at greater rates than in 2023. But even though rates are depressed, fuel and tire expenses were trending downward in Q1, as were Class 8 used truck prices, and repair and maintenance costs, were below inflation. So while there's no doubt that conditions have been tough, there are opportunities in every market. Fleets can still maintain operational efficiencies. They can seize cost savings to get through the cycle. And by focusing on life cycle management and paying attention to their KPIs, they can create the total lowest cost of ownership and remain competitive.
Because we've seen a lot of fleets exiting the market, whether they were small, a lot of more small new entrants that kind of jumped in to take advantage of those high spot rates. We've seen some bigger fleets, though, that have been around for a while struggle and even shut their doors. So talking about this, the KPIs and lowest total cost of ownership, what are some things that they need to be looking at in order to deal with, be better prepared, take advantage of these kinds of cycles?
As we all know, the industry is very cyclical. And that cyclical nature really requires fleets to be flexible and adaptable. So rather than just responding to the market, having a multi-year strategy built around the life cycle of their assets really can help fleets to better navigate these cycles. We're using a lot of data analytics today, including predictive modeling, that helps fleets to make better informed decisions and allows them to better respond to fluctuations in the market and still maintain a competitive edge.
I'm basically taking a bit of a longer term view than just reacting, being a proactive right, instead of reactive. Now from what I understand, Fleet Advantage customers are primarily private fleets. How has the last cycle affected private fleets perhaps differently than for-hire fleets?
Well, private fleets have certainly fared better than the for-hire carriers in the current economic climate. Some of the difficulties that the for-hire carriers have faced been the result of expansion in the private fleet market. Private fleets benefit from a more controlled environment, and they can implement strategic planning more effectively. For-hire carriers face harsher economic realities, but the private fleets, can leverage, flexible leasing options and data-driven decisions and it will help all the fleets, be better positioned to weather these challenges.
So everybody wants to know, when might we expect things to improve? What are you talking to your customers about to help them in their planning?
Yeah, that's a good question. But there's a lot of optimism that economic conditions are improving. There's renewed hope that the Fed will start lowering interest rates, and that would alleviate some of the cost pressures on the equipment investments. Freight fundamentals are expected to recover in 24, driven by consumer spending. However, strategic planning and flexibility will be crucial for fleets to be able to capitalize on these improvements.
Another thing we've been hearing about from a lot of fleets are some concerns, questions, uncertainties about upcoming emissions regulations, both criteria pollutants like NOx, as well as greenhouse gas emissions. At the same time, there are fleets, especially private fleets, with sustainability goals of their own. What are you seeing there, and any trends in kind of how fleets are addressing these issues in their planning?
Well, emissions regulations are pushing fleets to adopt more sustainable practices. So there has been some emphasis on electric trucks, although that seems to be waning. Clean diesel and hydrogen are all critical components of an emissions reduction strategy. From Fleet Advantage's point of view, we've had a pretty significant commitment to sustainability for organizations that have transportation fleets. And that commitment leads to a shorter cycle that significantly reduces CO2 emissions. In calendar year 2023, our focus on shorter life cycles helped our clients to reduce their environmental impact by reducing 300,000 metric tons of CO2. And that brings our total since we started to about 1.3 million metric tons of CO2 reductions. But Deborah, we can't talk about environmental sustainability without talking about economic sustainability. Fleets need to have a long-term strategy that aligns their life cycle with a multi-year plan. Not only will they achieve their sustainability measures, they'll improve the performance of their fleet and also the overall health of their business.
We've heard talk of a likely pre-buy as fleets decide to kind of stock up on the current technology. Some analysts say that's already started. What are your thoughts there?
Well, our pre-buy is prompting a lot of fleets to expedite their procurement plans. As the new emission regulations target diesel exhaust emissions in 27, is going to result in the largest truck pre-buy ever, which some say has already started. Having flexibility in your business strategy, I think, is essential to navigate these regulatory changes. Fleets need to be closely monitoring how the CARB pre-buy will impact their procurement plans. So rather than taking a reactionary approach, so staying adaptable, following a data-driven approach, will help mitigate the uncertainty. And then by implementing strategies such as having a multi-year procurement plan, is going to give fleets the ability to not only meet their ESG goals, but also to have the most suitable equipment, for their particular operation.
And that's really important too, that obviously trucking is not a one-size-fits-all industry, and it's become increasingly necessary to make sure those trucks are really what you need, what's going to be most effective and efficient in your fleet's operations, right?
Yes.
So you talked about data. Tell us a little bit more about the role of data in all this. I mean, there is so much data available today from the trucks, from your management systems, from your maintenance systems, from telematics. It can be overwhelming. So talk a little bit about how fleets can take advantage of all this data to make these kind of strategic decisions that we've been talking about.
You're right. There is data coming from a lot of different sources. We try to advise our clients to be selective in the type of data that they're looking at. And so part of our strategy and our value proposition is that we help synthesize that data into what we believe is actionable. And using that actionable data, together with deep industry expertise, can help guide fleets through what is going to be a pretty turbulent environment. So data and artificial intelligence are playing a crucial role in today's fleet management. Accurate data is essential for AI implementation. It's essential to drive better decision making and strategic planning. So at Fleet Advantage, we're leveraging billions of miles of data to help our clients make better decisions, and combining that data with predictive modeling and flexible financing really helps our clients to be better positioned, to be competitive, and ready to navigate any type of market changes that we're facing.
You mentioned artificial intelligence, and that's certainly been a lot of discussion about that with the latest generations of what's going on. But is that what the old computer saying? Garbage in, garbage out. And we hear about AI hallucinations. Any other thoughts there on AI and where we're going with that?
Well, I think we're just at the forefront of how AI is going to impact our industry, impact our economy, and impact our daily lives. And so, we're advising our clients to take this approach, to look at how they can integrate AI into their everyday operations, how they can benefit from it, but also to take a more conservative view on rather than just jumping full into the AI.
All right. So Brian, anything else that you think fleets ought to know that we haven't discussed already?
I would just echo the comments I made earlier. It's a fascinating time in the industry with the transition to alternative fuels, with the CARB pre-buy. There's no lack of challenges in the industry, but I would also say that there's no lack of opportunities. So fleets that are responsive, that utilize data, that are able to synthesize through some of the difficulties, will find themselves better positioned to compete in the marketplace.
Oh, great. Well, thanks so much for your insights on that, Brian. I think that's all we've got time for today, but thanks for joining us on HDT Talks Trucking. For our viewers and listeners, thanks for joining us as well. We've been talking to Brian Holland of Fleet Advantage. Don't forget to subscribe to HDT Talks Trucking on YouTube or your favorite podcast platform.